The discussion I see people having a lot, and it's been going on for a little while, and it's one of those that you feel like people didn't really want to dip their toe into, but now after the game on Saturday, it feels like they're in a better situation to really kind of lean into it. And it's a question of whether or not it's time for the Steelers to move on from Mike Tomlin. I don't think for a moment, for a second, that the noise would have to get so loud before they did that. And I don't feel like the noise has been loud enough. Now, when I start talking about the noise getting loud enough, typically the noise that I'm talking about that reaches that level of volume is noise that starts via back channel from the organization itself. That's when you start hearing sources are telling us that management is growing impatient with the lack of postseason success, yada, yada, that kind of thing, right? If I'm not mistaken, Sean, didn't they just sign Mike Tomlin to an extension?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they locked him in, and I think he's a coach.
June.
He's a coach there for as long as he wants to be.
Yeah, he's there at least through 2027. Now, let's also be clear. I mean, Bill Belichick, I want to say, signed an extension right before they fired him, and he was probably making a lot more money than Mike Tomlin was. The Steelers also are just a little bit cheap, so I don't think they'd be in the business of paying him not to coach. So I don't think they're going to wind up making a change. I do think the question of whether or not they should make a change when it comes to him is fascinating, because the argument for firing Mike Tomlin, it's the argument that got Marty Schottenheimer fired a lot of places, which is, we are never going to be bad. Marty Schottenheimer in his entire coaching career had 2 losing seasons. You were never going to be bad with Marty Schottenheimer as your coach. If I am not mistaken, Marty Schottenheimer's last game as an NFL coach was in January 2007 as coach of the San Diego Chargers, who went, I believe, 14-2 that season, the first season that Phillip Rivers was the starting quarterback. You may recall, by the way, that is the game where it looked like the Chargers had locked it up because the Patriots were driving, and then the Chargers made an interception that pretty much would have iced the game, and then the Chargers fumbled that interception. The Patriots got the ball, and then they went down the field and won. I couldn't remember if it was in overtime or not, but that is the chain of events that led to the Chargers losing that game. And Marty Schottenheimer got fired because A.J. Smith, the general manager, hated his guts. But nobody's putting Marty Schottenheimer in the Hall of Fame, largely because he didn't make a Super Bowl. Marty Schottenheimer was on the business end of some of the most demoralizing losses that one could think of. The John Elway drive in 1986, I believe there was also another very similar drive in 1987. Like, Schottenheimer tended to show up for those things. Anyway, the point I was going to make is that Marty Schottenheimer stopped coaching for good in 2006. The last time that he won a playoff game was in January of 1994. Against the Houston Oilers at the Astrodome, and the Houston Oilers quarterback was Warren Moon, and their defensive coordinator was Buddy Ryan. Okay, that shit might as well come on a reel-to-reel, that when it start playing, you start hearing pop, 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 pop. Like that's how far back it seemed. But even the Chargers didn't really fire him because they just got tired of being pretty good. That's not exactly what happened under those circumstances. I've seen some comparisons to Andy Reid being let go of with the Eagles, which is the idea that you have a good coach and you know you have a good coach, but now it's time for that good coach to go away. The reason that it was clear that it was time for that particular good coach to go away was in the year 2012, the Eagles went 4-12. They missed the playoffs in back-to-back seasons. They went 8-8, and then they went 4-12, okay? It was 4 straight years without a playoff win. Now, as I have discussed on this show, and we have discussed a few other times, the Steelers have not won a playoff game since Obama was the president. The Steelers have not had a very good team, I would argue, since January 2017. The question that you have to ask yourself about the Steelers, if you're going to say Mike Tomlin needs to go or whether or not Mike Tomlin needs to go, is what is the reason that they have not been better, okay? Now, if you wanted to make an argument that you needed to cut ties with Mike Tomlin because they were good but not good enough and maybe changing coaches would have done something, this wasn't it. That time was a few years ago. That time was when the Steelers were getting their asses kicked by the Patriots every single time. Bill Belichick would cook that man. There was no other way to look at it. They could win a bunch of other games and they could win over a whole bunch of other people. But when the rubber met the road and he ran up against the Patriots, regular season, postseason, didn't matter. He was getting cooked. Now, it does so happen as I look at this, it only happened in the postseason one time. But that to me was looking like a clear, and by the way, it was the last year they won a playoff game, 2016. But to me, that was a clear indication that there was a ceiling that they weren't getting over with him, and that ceiling was beating those very good Patriots teams. And it was a fair question to ask whether or not the holdup was the coach, because if you watch those games, they were getting out coached. That was the time to me that if you wanted to ask the question about whether to move on from Mike Tomlin, okay, maybe then was the time that you did it. Now, the question that you ask is, why don't they have a quarterback? That seems to be the question that has to be solved. And whether or not Mike Tomlin is the coach, that's the thing the Steelers have got to deal with, because they're over there in the conference that has all the quarterbacks. And they have either come out there with a shell of Ben Roethlisberger or some variety of bum ever since. The two quarterbacks that they got this year are really famous, but they are two quarterbacks that their previous teams literally gave away. So what are you going to do to fix that? Well, see, that raised the question to me about the Steelers, which is there kind of inherent conservatism as an organization a thing that gets them in trouble? Like when they made that trade and they gave up picks to get Minkah Fitzpatrick, I went through and looked at the Steelers draft history. And if you looked at it, I'm sure there were like little changes here and there that came up from time to time. But if you looked at it, for something like 40 years, they had one first round pick every year. They weren't moving into the first round. They weren't moving out of the first round. The Steelers stayed with their first round pick. It didn't really matter what they needed. It didn't matter if they needed a quarterback or whatever it is. That is what they did. They did not make big moves. And in order for a team that is consistently pretty good to get themselves a quarterback, you're probably going to either have to really stink for 1 year or you're going to have to make a big move. This team did not make a big move. They drafted Kenny Pickett, for example, right? The year that Lamar Jackson was in the draft, they did not do that. If they're not going to be willing to make a big move to get a quarterback, it doesn't matter who the coach is. Now, what I don't know is how much of that decision-making has to do with the coach, but I know from their track record that they just don't make big moves, generally speaking. That's not what they do. Now, the other argument, or the other point I want to make is just something to throw out there. The argument that the standard for the Pittsburgh Steelers is winning championships, and that is simply not true. If we want to look at the history of the Pittsburgh Steelers in its totality, before the run of the 1970s, right, before the Chuck Noll era, they were one of the worst teams in the NFL. In fact, you might have been able to make an argument that they were the worst team in the NFL. They was out there looking like the old Clippers. You youngsters don't know what that means, but, you know, the old heads know what I'm talking about here. Basically, the Steelers had an owner who the Pittsburgh newspaper did a long series. He was a racketeer. That was his real bag. And then after they passed that from him to the next son actually ran a competent football operation. They figured out a couple of market inefficiencies. Largely, they did a lot of scouting at HBCUs and some other stuff that we don't need to talk about right now. But anyway, they had that run where they went to and won 4 Super Bowls in 6 seasons. That was followed up by the entirety of the 1980s that were pretty mediocre. Bill Cowher took over the team in 1992. They went to a Super Bowl in 1995. They didn't go to another Super Bowl until 2005. Tomlin gets the job in 2007, goes Super Bowl in 2008, go to Super Bowl in 2010. But they're a team that had a couple of runs, by and large. And they've been pretty good at different points. But the idea that this is a franchise that only stands for competing for championships, if that's the case, then Chuck Noll doesn't keep his job from 1980 to 1991. Right? Those 3 years where Bill Cowher missed the playoffs. If the standard was that, then Bill Cowher would have gotten fired at that point. That's not what the standard is. The standard for the Steelers is, hey, man, we got a certain way that we're going to do this, and we think that keeping it steady along that pattern is the way to get it done. It interferes with that ability. That makes perfect sense if they feel that way. Just don't invoke the past to try to make the point. Hell, those 4 Super Bowls we talking about, guys, I'm 44 years old. That all happened before I was born. The quarterback for them teams, he been on television for goddamn 35 years. Terry Bradshaw. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to tell y'all, right? People get saying this stuff. They forget about what's actually true. What is going to get better by getting Tomlin out of there? Now, sometimes it becomes a case where you got to make change for the sake of change. I think Andy Reid in Pittsburgh, in Philadelphia at the end was an example of that. But again, there was a clear reason to believe that they stopped listening to him, that it stopped landing with him. They had that dream team season in 2011 and then the 2012 thing where they went 4-12. It was fair to say, hey, this thing is falling apart. You're not really at that place with the Steelers. Now, sometimes you can get ambitious with it and try to get out ahead of the dip. But the truth is, Tomlin's demonstrated there probably ain't going to be no dip. What you need is a quarterback. You can't answer any of these questions until you get a quarterback. Because if you go get somebody else, all they going to be like is, damn, can somebody give me a quarterback? The NBA is in full swing and the NFL playoffs have begun, which means you could turn $10 into $1,000 in a single game watching your favorite teams only on Prize Picks. You can make a Prize Picks lineup between the NFL and the NBA in as little as 60 seconds. Sign up today and get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to receive the $50 bonus. It's guaranteed. Quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, and an enormous selection of players and stat types are what make Prize Picks the #1 fantasy sports app. So you make sure you go to prizepicks.com/Bomani and use code Bomani for a first deposit match up to $100. That's prizepicks.com/Bomani. Prize Picks, daily fantasy sports made easy.